Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Archives virtual program series. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. We're delighted you're joining us from home today. Through this programming, we're opening up the doors of the National Archives for you at home, the records, the documents, everything that we've got. We want to try and get into your house for this time that we're all stuck at home and bring you lively discussions to bring the documents and our history alive. By now, hopefully you're receiving our American Experience emails on Tuesday, or for our young history buffs, we've got history snacks every Friday for families and kids, special content for you. Before I begin, I want to make sure you know our featured guests will be taking questions as we get into the program. So now's your time to turn to your chat box just to the side of your video in YouTube. And that's where you can ask your questions. So right now, if you want to practice, send me your hometown and your state. We'd love to see who's watching, where you're watching from. We always have terrific viewership from around the country. So let us know how you're doing and send your questions there. You don't have to wait to the end as the conversation's going on. If someone says something you have a question about, feel free to put the question in, and we'll try and get those all in the queue when we get to that period. Before we begin with our special guests, we have a message from our Rightfully Hers honorary committee member, Senator Shelly Capito. She's been a terrific support for us, and we are delighted to have this special message today.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you in celebration of a historic moment. I cherish the opportunity to open the conversation between the three trailblazers before us today. It is hard to believe that the elections that you will oversee this fall would have barred your participation just over 100 years ago. Can you imagine having ideas, having opinions, knowing in your head and your heart that you should be able to express those ideas and opinions, share them with the world, and take them with you to the ballot box, and then being told that your ideas and opinions don't matter? Being told that your ideas and opinions don't count? I'm sure many of you and many of us have felt that at one time or another. But for the suffragists, it wasn't even a question. It was the way things were. Until these women, these suffragists, said enough, and they stood up and they organized and they put on their purple and their white and their gold and their sashes. They paraded in the streets, they made their voices heard, and they changed history. The 19th Amendment gave women more than just the right to vote. In many ways, it gave women the courage to run, to advocate, to lead. As the first woman senator elected from the state of West Virginia, I am forever grateful for these women as they paved the path for us, women leaders of the future. Now it is our job to be effective leaders and inspire the next generation of women to rise up and to continue to expand the number of women in leadership positions across our country. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all. I hope everyone stays healthy and safe, and I look forward to the discussion from our distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. She's been a real champion of the National Archives and our Rightfully Hers initiative from the National Archives that has put together our big exhibit, traveling shows, educational materials, and this kind of programming. Well, I'm delighted to let's get to the speakers today. We've got three Secretaries of State who are in charge of their elections in their states and our elections as citizens. I'm going to start from west to east because that's what the 19th Amendment, right? The voting rights for women started in the West. Kim Wyman, Secretary Wyman from Washington. When she finished college, she traveled abroad where she was first inspired to get into the election and civic engagement work that she's in. She was in county election leadership for a decade before assuming her current position in 2012. And we've got Secretary Laurel Lee from Florida. She has 2 degrees from the University of Florida, has served as an attorney, public defender, was a circuit court judge before becoming Secretary of State in 2019. And Secretary Tahesha from New Jersey. She has 2 degrees, one in English and American literature and a law degree. She's been a law clerk, a television producer, literature professor and attorney, and a judge before taking this position in 2018. Secretary Way, hopefully you can pop your video on and we'll be ready to go. Excellent. Maybe we'll get some questions about how your American literature degree is getting hard at work here in this time in your position. So I want to make sure you're all have the opportunity to unmute yourself when we get there, because we're going to jump right in. First thing I want to ask you, it's been a big week for the National Archives. We like to brag. We have the 19th Amendment. We wish it was on view to the public right now when we reopen the doors. I'm sure it will be. But tell me, what are you doing in your states? What have you been doing to celebrate this important anniversary? And let's just jump in. And you personally, what did you do yesterday to celebrate the big day? Why don't we start with Secretary Wyman?
Well, here in Washington State, we, of course, are very proud of our history with women and voting and the franchise. And this year, our Legacy Washington team put together an amazing exhibit called Ahead of the Curve. And it really highlights historical Washington women who have just made great strides in all areas of not only the law and political leadership, but also just innovations in tech and every industry you can imagine. And so we partnered historical stories of women pioneers with their modern day counterparts. And it's just an amazing exhibit available online at the Secretary of State's website. And it's really just championing the accomplishments. And of course, Washington might have been ahead of the curve on women's suffrage as well. Back when we were a territory, our territorial legislature actually gave women, at least white women, not unfortunately all women in Washington State, the right to vote back in 1854. And our Supreme Court, unfortunately, in 1888, rolled that back with a stroke of the pen, and they said, oh, they meant to put in male before citizenship. But in 1910, our legislature did have the good sense to give women the right to vote 10 years ahead of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So we're really proud because I think Washington helped jumpstart the national suffrage movement again, and is part of why the amendment passed. So we're just very excited to be part of this today, and thanks to the archives for the work that you do in sharing this wonderful history with everyone.
Terrific. Well, it sounds like some Western bragging there. Secretary Lee, how are we celebrating in Florida?
Well, in Florida, our legislature actually established a Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. And the role of that commission, which met several times last year, was to consider the history of the amendment and what we needed to be doing as a state to properly celebrate this important year. So that group put together a number of really wonderful recommendations, some of which we've been able to do, some we have not, of course, because times have changed these last few months. So some of our important in-person celebrations have been postponed. But we do have a special exhibit in our Museum of Florida History called Beyond the Vote, Florida Women's Activism, that is going to be ready to go as soon as we are welcoming visitors back to our museum in person. And we also set up a website, celebratesuffrageflorida.com, that has some really important information about history here, some of our significant pioneers in the women's suffrage movement, and also some events, information about events and things that we are doing, and of course some great photographs and information from our state archives.
Terrific. Like how we can get the archives materials in there. Well done. Secretary Way, how about New Jersey?
Thanks, Patrick. And I just want to thank the National Archives Foundation and, of course, in partnership with our national organization for having this important discussion about the centennial of the 19th Amendment. For us in New Jersey, one of my divisions is the Historical Commission. So what we have done in partnership with, I want to say, an estimated 70 organizations, including the Alice Paul Institute, we launched last year the NJ Women Vote, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment initiative last year. And so some of the events that I could highlight, which were, of true significance to all of us, was partnering with various New Jersey schools in which we developed the 19th Amendment curriculum. We actually hosted a series of mock elections for New Jersey students, grades 4 to 12, because we want our youth to have that civic engagement love during their early years. We also have ongoing a bicycle slow roll in which we're asking New Jerseyans and their families, social distancing, of course, to just participate in a safe bicycle roll throughout some of the various historic suffrage sites in New Jersey. And then just yesterday, we held, my co-chair is First Lady Tammy Murphy. We created a virtual Women's Equality Day event where we brought together New Jersey women leaders, artists, and historians. And we're looking forward to having something in Trenton come next month to further the showcase and the education and value of what the 19th Amendment is and will be for all moving forward futuristically. And the one thing that we wanted to capture throughout this whole experience of this initiative is just the understanding that while we do celebrate this 100th moment, we also were recognizing and will recognize that there were various women, such as myself, Indigenous women, Hispanic women, Asian women, who still did not gain the right to vote from the historical perspective. So we're looking forward to continuing the outreach, especially given this year. We see it as a true year in which we're recognizing and celebrating our democracy.
Terrific. Well, and I know one of the things I've learned as we've worked on this initiative for several years before we opened it last year in advance of the anniversary was that New Jersey actually gave women the right to vote. Although Washington has a good case for being an early adopter, I feel like New Jersey was ahead of the curve. You want to tell folks about its history with voting?
Yes, you're right. Similar to Secretary Wyman's mention, women and Black individuals were actually allowed to vote in, I want to say, up until 1807 when it changed. Just as long previously, if they had ownership of various properties, both women and Black individuals could be voters.
Just like that, like you say, a stroke of the pen, and it takes hundreds of plus years to get that back. Well, let's just, before we jump into some of the specifics of your job, I'm curious because it's such a big anniversary. Do you remember the first time you voted? What was that experience like? Feel free. Secretary Lee, why don't you jump in first?
So I think the important story for me, my important voting story, was a time when I had a friend who was running for Congress, and he was involved in a runoff election, and it was raining. I was very busy at work. It was really hard to get to the polls. But really, I think because of my personal connection with this person, I made the time and I made it happen. And what really ended up resonating with me about this experience is that he won. He was successfully elected and went on to serve several terms in Congress, but by a razor thin margin, by just a handful of votes. And it showed me how incredibly important each vote is. And as I do my job now and really try to connect with potentially eligible but unregistered voters and encourage them to get involved, or speak to registered voters who maybe don't always turn out. You know, particularly in Florida, we have a history of razor thin election margins. And so I always try to impress upon voters that it is true that every single voice matters and every single vote counts. So, you know, to really try to encourage that kind of make that extra effort and actually get out and cast that ballot, because you never know if yours is going to be the one, you know, that really makes a difference.
Right. Secretary Wyman?
Yeah, a similar story, I think. I first voted in 1980, and it was a presidential election. And so it became something that was just part of, you know, my day-to-day, I guess, civic duty, if you will, through my early 20s. And in about 1989, my husband and I were stationed overseas when he was in the Army, and we received our ballots the day after an election. And I didn't realize at the time how important voting was to me until you have that right taken away. And there was nothing I could do about it. It just kind of came and went, and I didn't think much of it. And when I came back to the stateside, we moved here to Washington, and I became the election director. And I realized the really important job I had to ensure that that didn't happen to anyone else. And I've really made that the foundation of the job that I do every day, is just making sure that every eligible person in my charge has an opportunity to cast a vote. And I don't think it was a moment that really changed my perception of the importance of voting and the importance of my vote, when I realized that it had been taken away. And I think when I started doing this as a profession, realizing that there are so many people in our country's history who were denied that right for, you know, decades, and it was because of their gender or the color of their skin, or because of the you know, tribal nation they belonged to, whatever it was. That's not okay, and it's just an honor to get to do this work and work with my colleagues around the country to ensure that every vote is counted and that every eligible person has an opportunity to participate.
Secretary Way?
Thanks, Patrick. There's been so many good memories about voting, but for me, as I think about this, you know, I'm a mom of 4 girls, and I love whatever position I'm in, when I have the opportunity to bring them along with me. And for me, I just think back to the 2008 election. At the time, my husband and I only had the 3 girls, 11, 8, and I believe the youngest at the time was 5. But being able to bring them into the ballot box, per se, and somehow be a part of history. And no matter who you vote for, just the idea that you know that you have voted. And especially as I think about this, for our young kids, and that's one of the priorities for me as secretary, for our young kids to get it and understand that they too need to be civic engaged. And I really feel that moment in time was one of the momentous, if you will, experiences of voting.
It's terrific. I'm just looking at the time. I want to make sure we get to the meat of the conversation here. So why don't we jump in with your respective states and your jobs. You're on this conversation because you're in charge of elections, but I know you also have other responsibilities. So what does the role as the chief election official for your state, what does that role look like in the election process? And so we'll work in reverse order. How about Secretary Way?
Okay. I want to say it's my role as the top election official in the state is really focusing on 2 sides, in my opinion, of an election coin, of protection on one side, and the other side is always going to be accessibility. And as the chief election official, I cannot do this alone. That is the sense that my work is in partnership with our local and county officials who, in my opinion, are the frontline workers of our democracy, who truly ensure, in partnership with my office, that the resources and support of the elections can be accomplished in a free, fair, and safe manner.
Terrific. Secretary Lee?
So in Florida, we are responsible at the state level for facilitating voter registration, voting, and the conduct of elections in coordination with all 67 of our county supervisors of elections. We provide administrative support to ensure fair and accurate elections, and also, of course, ensure that our election code and statutes and rules are being followed consistently throughout the state. We are also responsible for promoting public awareness and public outreach around elections. So we place a lot of emphasis on trying to reach voters and encourage voters to come out, to participate. And we also manage our Florida voter registration system, which houses the voter data for more than 14 million registered voters.
Okay, Secretary Wyman?
Very similar threads to Secretaries Way and Lee. Washington, I am in charge of overseeing the elections. We do certification and training of our county election partners. And here in our state, we really do try to approach this as a partnership between those local election officials and our office. We do house the statewide voter registration database as well. And the counties are the ones who actually administer the elections. Here in Washington, we have the citizen right of initiative and referendum. So that process is overseen in my office, and we do the signature verification for that and qualifying those measures for the ballot. And then beyond that, it really is what Secretary Way was talking about, is really ensuring that you're balancing that access and security in a way that you inspire confidence in every voter in Washington, regardless of their party affiliation from the far left to the far right. And that takes work every day.
And I'm assuming from each of your departments that communications is just vital, especially because things are changing. So we're in the middle of a pandemic. How has the voting process changed on the ground during this? So Secretary Lee, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Well, in Florida, we have 3 methods of voting, and this was true prior to the pandemic. We have no excuse to vote by mail, so any voter who wants to vote by mail can do so. We have early voting, and then we have election day voting. So in that regard, we were actually very well situated to adjust to the new and different demands that came to us in terms of the pandemic. What we saw in our recent primary election was that a greater percentage of voters than would be typical opted to vote by mail. But we still had many voters who chose each of those 3 methods. We also worked very hard to ensure that for voters who voted in person, that they were protected, and so were election workers. So we worked with our local supervisors of election to ensure that they had access to the personal protective equipment that they needed, and hand sanitizers, masks, cleaning equipment, everything that they needed to keep those polling locations safe. And that they were aware of all the current health guidance from the Florida Department of Health and the CDC about things like social distancing for voters who came out to the polls.
Okay. Secretary Wyman?
Yeah, so Washington has been a vote by mail state since 2011. And I think many people across the country just assume that we were really well positioned to just transition seamlessly to the COVID environment. And like every other state in the country, it's been a major transition. I would say between 1% and 2% of our voters vote in person. We mail out ballots about 18 days prior to Election Day, and that's really also our early voting period, if you will. And so we had to come up with ways to keep our voters and our election workers safe, do all of the social distancing and PPE and all of that. So our counties have just been adapting to doing these services. In fact, The biggest thing they do during the pre-election period is issue replacement ballots, to be honest. So they created curbside pickup for our voters, and across the state in our biggest and smallest jurisdictions, people could drive up and receive a replacement ballot or register and get a ballot for the first time. So I think we're all struggling with very similar threads and trying to be as innovative as possible, mostly keeping our election workers healthy so they're going to be able to work through the whole cycle. But we're going to get through this together. And I think all the states are working together to try to help each other.
Sure. Secretary Way?
Okay, so similar to what Secretary Lee has mentioned, New Jersey also had the infrastructure basically in place because we're no excuse in terms of vote by mail. And we understood that, we want to move democracy forward during this COVID-19 time, but of course we want to do it safely. That's why we transitioned into the primarily vote by mail model. We still had, and we still will have for November, polling locations available, but at the same time, the goal is and the focus is making sure not only the voters are remaining safe and healthy. We, of course, want to safeguard our poll workers and also any election workers. So we have set forth, similar to what we did in the primary election, that registered active voters will receive a ballot. But again, with all of the safety protocols in place for our polling locations, we are setting forth that these venues, these polling locations will be available for the disabled and for those voters who still need to cast their ballot.
Terrific. Well, I'm just looking at the time here. I want to make sure we've got time for questions. I want to remind our viewers that you can put your questions in the chat box on YouTube, so we can get those in the queue. I do have a few other ones here. We'll keep going. I think we've hit on a couple of the questions we're sort of thinking about. So if I'm going to come vote in your state, assuming I was registered in your state, of course, what are you doing to ensure the safety of voters? You've talked a little bit about the workers and all of that, but so I'm coming in and I'm actually gonna vote in person. Secretary Lee?
Sure. So many of the things I touched on before are foundational parts of making sure that voters can have a safe experience if they opt to vote in person. So we have made sure that all of our local election officials are aware of all of the current public health guidance as that has evolved, that they have the equipment and supplies in hand that they need to make sure that polling locations are kept clean and sanitized in between voters as voters come through. And voters are social distanced and, of course, asked to wear masks as well if they're entering any sort of precinct location. One thing that I think, I try to share when we're out talking about this particular topic is I want voters to know how hard we're working at the state and local level to make the voting experience safe and protected for them. But it also might take a little bit longer, as we try to ensure that voters are kept at social distance, that there are not too many voters in a precinct location at one time, and taking the time to sanitize equipment and door handles and things that may be touched as voters come through. That takes a little bit longer than our typical voting experience. So we're asking voters to also observe those same health and safety precautions. Of course, if they're not well, to choose another option as opposed to coming to vote in person, and to be patient with their local elections administrators if that line is a little longer or they do have to wait a little longer than they would in a typical year.
Okay, Secretary Way? Oh, I think you're still muted. Oh, one click too many. You were
Okay.
there. There we go.
Yes, I apologize. Connection is unstable, but similar to what Secretary Lee just said, and I'll be brief with this. Of course, just making certain, which we are doing, to provide the necessary PPE to the election workers at the polling locations for everyone to understand that they need to be patient while voting, to mask up, to practice social distancing. And, not to go back to the voting by mail aspect, but that too is part of this health and safety protocol. And, that's why we're making certain in New Jersey that there will be other options for those who would want to return their ballots outside of in the mail, having the requisite number of ballot secure drop boxes in the community. So everyone, again, needs to continue to practice the proper social distancing and sanitation of any location, and just be mindful of and patient of how these things will evolve.
Absolutely. Secretary Wyman, I think I'm going to start to pivot here. I want to get some of these questions in. But you were in your position for the last presidential election. Can you talk about, from your vantage point, does this election feel the same? I have to feel it might feel a little bit different, but we're interested. You have a lot of experience, obviously, in this work.
Well, I'll put an even finer point on it. This is my 7th presidential election that I've been on the administrative side of. And in that time, I've never seen an election like this one. Election officials by nature are planners. We like to know things well in advance. I would venture a guess that most states are like ours. We started planning this election 2 years ago. And we thought we had it wired going in November of last year, December of last year. We thought we were set. And then, sure, throw in Russian hacking. No problem. We got this. We got this.
Oh, it just muted
we
yourself.
got that.
There you go. Right.
Pandemic, we got that too. No problem. And then let's add social unrest and protest. And this year just feels like politicization. Let's try to make the administration of elections a political topic, and it just kind of keeps going. And I now am no longer asking what else can we have. It's just the other day a friend of mine sent me a text and said that that there's an asteroid coming towards Earth right around election day. And I just said, okay, universe, I tap out. You win. You win. I can't do this anymore. So yes, unprecedented times. I hate to use that overused catchphrase, but unprecedented. Absolutely. Nothing like 4 years ago.
So we're not quite ready for interstellar interference, but we've got pretty much everything else covered. That's good. There is one sort of elephant in the room. We sort of talked around it. A couple weeks ago, I helped my 90-plus-year-old mom fill out her form. She was in Maryland to fill out her absentee form, and we looked very carefully at the deadlines and the timeline and all of that. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about the mail. Can voters trust that their ballots will make it and be counted? Will their voice be heard? I'd love for each of you to have a chance to talk about that. Secretary Lee, why don't you start?
Sure. So I am confident that we have a tried and true vote by mail system in Florida. It's not new to us. It's something we're very familiar with and we know how to do well. In Florida, a voter must request a vote by mail ballot before it's sent to that voter. And then when it is returned, that voter's signature is verified with the existing record at the Supervisor of Elections office. So we have some really important safeguards in place to ensure the integrity of that process. And with respect to the return of the vote by mail ballots, we had a very good experience with our primary and the Postal Service. We had very few issues in that regard, and by and large, it was very successful. But another important piece of ballot return is that voters do have the option if they're concerned about their vote getting back in time to be there by 7 p.m. on election day, voters can take that vote and deliver it to a drop box at an early voting location, or they can drop it off at the office of their supervisor of election on election day. So that's another important option for voters if they don't feel comfortable that it might get there on time.
Okay, Secretary Way.
Yes, I just want to, echo what Secretary Lee has just said. And, we have Secretary Wyman there. It's a safe and secure method of voting. There's the chain of custody in play. I know that in New Jersey, a voter can track on our division when their ballot leaves their home and when it gets to their respective county board of elections. There are the secure drop boxes, again, for voters who choose not to return their ballots by mail, and even for our general, voters can bring their vote by mails to their respective polling location to also drop their ballots off. But the one thing that when I've been speaking on all of the Zoom virtual events and conferences on elections, the one thing I'm trying to impart to the voters is that they, during this unprecedented election, must take a deeper dive and really be informed and engaged in terms of however they're deciding to vote. They need to have an awareness of their local election officials who they can, consult if they have any specific questions. I know that our county clerks have to send out ballots to the registered active voters by October 5th. And we've been telling voters that, by mid-October, if you have not gotten your ballot and you're actively registered, you should contact your local election official to check status. So they also have to realize as a voter who to look to. I know on a national front, on a state front, we've been saying that state secretaries of states are those trusted voices if they have any questions. It is a team effort in terms of this November election. And I, have confidence that if we all do our part, it can run successfully.
Okay. And Secretary Wyman.
I think my colleagues have said pretty much everything. I think
Very
what's
good.
really important is voters need to reach out, as Secretary Way said, to their local election officials, to their state election officials. And we're all part of a national concept called Trusted Info 2020. And it's a hashtag that we're going to start using, and probably most states have already started, to try to drive voters to trusted sources like their Secretary of State office or the local election official or trusted media sources for information, so that they're not just getting something on social media that may actually provide misinformation or disinformation and de-incentivize them from voting. And we want to make sure that every eligible American has a chance to have their voice heard this November, and we're all going to work to that end.
Thank you. Yes, and I think that what you've all emphasized, and obviously each state has slightly strategies might be the same, the deadlines, the dates, that there are nuances, and you need to know that if you're going to exercise that. So we've got folks from Panama City, Florida, California, New York, Michigan, Virginia, let's see, Oklahoma, Texas. We've got it covered here. So we want to jump in. One of the questions, which I think is a good one, we were starting to touch on this. What are your strategies to increase voter participation? You've touched on that a little bit, Secretary Wyman. So Secretary Way, Secretary Lee, one of you
I would love to take a minute on this one.
Please.
This is one of the things I'm most excited about between now and November. So Florida recently joined ERIC, which is a multi-state information sharing group that really helps us do two things. First, it helps us clean up our voter rolls a bit. It helps us identify if there are people who are registered in more than one state that haven't updated their registration. But the piece that I'm really excited about is that we will be contacting every single potentially eligible but unregistered voter in Florida, and sending that person a postcard with information on how to get registered and their options for voting, so they can choose the option that's right for them. But that is something that we are very much looking forward to, and hoping that we will have an unprecedented number of voters registered in advance of the presidential election.
Great.
Yeah.
Secretary White?
Oh,
Please.
okay. Thank you. For us, I think before you can even vote, you have to figure out ways, of course, to get folk registered. We're excited that around September 4th, we're actually going to launch our online voter registration. So that eliminates the need to print or mail anything, especially in this time of COVID. We're still, an automatic voter registration state. And earlier this year, any individuals who are on parole or probation are now eligible to register to vote here in New Jersey without paying any restoration fees or whatever. And then we're going to continue our college ballot bowl, as we call it, in which is a friendly, nonpartisan competition between our respective colleges and universities. We break them up into 3 separate conferences in accordance to their student population, again, to incentivize our youth to vote. And we are now ramping up our efforts in a different space, the poll worker space, because we all know, given the COVID-19 situation, there's been some question marks as to getting your regular bench of poll workers. So we're, tapping into outside normal areas of the poll worker bench, meaning we're in partnership, and I believe we're doing this with NAS, our national organization, and American Bar Association. I know my New Jersey Bar Association, they have decided to come with and somewhat, ask their membership to become poll workers, still tapping into the reservoir of college students and beyond. So that is, some of the ways in which we've been increasing and seek to increase voter engagement.
Terrific. Any details, Secretary Wyman, you want to add? I know you just touched on this a little bit.
Yes, very similar threads here in Washington. We're really putting an emphasis on voters checking their information right now. Is your address up to date? Have you changed your name? Are you registered? And really in that order, because I think a lot of times people hear, are you registered? And it's like, I've been registered for 30 years, and they forget that they've moved. So we're really going to emphasize that. And the vote starts with you is sort of our tagline, and just really trying to get people to be prepared. And we also are going to have some student engagement hubs. And I imagine also having an inter-college competition here in our state. But yes, anything we can do to emphasize the importance of voting.
Sure. If we can't have fall college football, we can have some election. I like that idea. So one of our viewers asked, what about the estimated time length? So if most voters are voting by mail, should we prepare ourselves for a lengthy process as you receive the results, or have you also anticipated and prepared for that? Why don't you start, Secretary Wyman?
Absolutely. This is probably the single issue now I'm switching my focus to in terms of getting the word out. Our experience here in Washington is very much one of delayed election results because we have a postmark cutoff for our ballots. As long as the voter gets a postmark on or before Election Day, and we receive that ballot back in this election, it will be 21 days afterwards, that ballot can be counted. And what we see and have seen in the decades we've been doing vote by mail is that we get about half or 6 in the primary we just had 60% of our ballots come in election week, and we saw a very large surge all the way through Thursday. So you physically aren't going to know election night who won. Just mathematically, half of the ballots that were cast that week were cast on when effectively were received on Wednesday and Thursday. So I think this is a trend that the country is going to see. States that are not familiar with high absentee ballot loads are going to be swamped right at the end of the voting period, whatever that rule is in their state law. And if their counties or their local election officials don't have the capacity and capability to process those ballots, it's going to take time. And that's perfectly normal. It's what we want to do because election officials ultimately want to be accurate. So really the messaging is going to start to shift to that expectation so voters and the media understand that nothing nefarious is going on. It is really doing the work that we should be doing in everyone's best interest.
Sure. And let me just sort of add to this because I'm looking at another question, and this might be my own ignorance or maybe it's state by state. Is there any thought in counting these absentee ballots before the election day? Is that possible? And I'll leave that to Secretary Lee or Secretary Way.
Sure. So you're absolutely right in that a lot of these specifics vary by states and what are their state election laws. In Florida, our situation is slightly distinct because we have a cutoff of 7 p.m. on election day. So for a vote by mail ballot to be counted, it must be returned and received by 7 p.m. on election day. So a big piece of our messaging is making sure that voters understand that. And that, again, as we discussed earlier, if it's a close call or they think that ballot might not get back, that they get it, drop it off, some other method of making sure that it gets returned. We also, one of the things that Governor DeSantis in Florida did in response to our conditions here with the pandemic was he expanded the amount of time that local election officials have to canvass those vote by mail ballots when they come in. So I know in our recent primary, those extra days to process those votes was very important to the supervisors of election and really helped them. They were all able to have everything up to current on election day and handle the load that came in actually on election day. But each of those intricacies will vary a lot state by state. And I've heard a number of secretaries, we're very optimistic in Florida that we'll be able to keep up with the wave. But I know I've heard many secretaries of state express that this may not be an election where the results are available on election night.
Secretary Way, did you want to add anything?
Just briefly, just noting, Secretary Lee and Secretary Wyman said it eloquently. It's all about the integrity of the results, but it's also about being optimistic. I know we in New Jersey are a postmark state. We have the window open for receipt of them up until 7 days, but we do have a cure period because we want to get this right. A vote is sacred, and I think that our voters need to understand to be optimistic, but at the same time, it's the accuracy and integrity of the vote.
Very good. And I want to help. We've got a couple of questions in our chat box about that. It's a URL, but it's also a hashtag. It's trustedinfo2020 is the hashtag for those who would like to follow that or explore, obviously, again, where to get the best sources of information. I see that I think I have taken up I have about a million more questions of my own, but I've taken up a lot of our time. So I want to get to a couple of closing questions here for you. What's interesting about this conversation to me is you hold such a fascinating perspective on government, democracy, civic participation. If you had a wish for the future of our country, whether it's this fall or, at the archives, we look forward to the 250th anniversary in 2026. We have a long horizon at the archives. What would you wish for our country? Why don't we start with Secretary Wyman?
I wish that we could get past some of the partisan divide and this rampant polarization that we've seen over the last, I'd say, I don't even know how many years it goes back, but Pew, I know, has done research and shows that America is the most polarized we've ever been. And I wish that we could remember that dialogue and that discussion, that civic engagement of having very different points of view politically can be done in a very respectful manner. And we can completely disagree on a policy issue or a point of view, but if we can listen to each other and get past that, and maybe sometimes even agree to disagree, but do it in a respectful manner instead of this, just yelling each other down or having a war on social media, I don't think it serves our country's interests in the way that it could. And it's the strength of democracy is that political discussion and discourse. And I wish we could get back to it being in a civil tone.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Way?
I would have to agree with Secretary Wyman. I also would want to add, especially since we're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, the hope that our democracy would be free from any barriers or discrimination.
Secretary Lee?
Yes, and I agree completely. I think that we have a real need for civil discourse, for civil discussion about important issues of the day, and would love to see us get back to a place where the dialogue around politics and elections is more like that. And I know as Secretaries of State, one of the things that I think we're always working every day to convey to voters is, elections may be partisan, but election administration is not. And we work very hard to ensure that voters feel confidence in the integrity of our systems, our process, our elections infrastructure, and also the work from their elections officials. So that I agree completely with my colleagues on vision for the future and where I would hope to see us as we move forward.
Terrific. And we got one more. We have to close with the 19th Amendment. So you've three distinctive women leaders in your state. You control the ballot box, if you will. 100 years ago, as of yesterday, women didn't even have, until yesterday, 100 years ago, women didn't even have the right to vote. If you were bumped into Susan B. Anthony or Alice Paul or Ida B. Wells, what might you say to them today? Secretary Way?
Okay, I would love to. That would be an honor, actually. And I want to say, if I bumped into Susan B. Anthony and New Jersey's own Alice Paul, I would sincerely thank them for their tireless work and for laying the foundation down for American women to participate in democracy. And if I had the opportunity to speak with Sojourner Truth or Ida B. Wells, I would truly thank them for their tireless work, because without them, women like me wouldn't even be in this space as an appointed election official, and even just the opportunity to vote.
Good. Secretary Wyman?
Oh, sure. Secretary Way got me a little teary just listening. It's and shocking. I'm a weeper, so it happens all the time. But I think when you think back on these extraordinary women and men who fought for women's suffrage and the suffrage of all Americans, regardless of gender or racial, anything, that all Americans have the equal right to vote, and the power of that. I think I would just thank them. And I think back on my two grandmothers who were the first in our family to get to vote their whole life. And they were single mothers in the 1940s and raised children in a time when women didn't do that alone. And they always inspired me to vote. And I think now they would just be shocked to know that their granddaughter was, Secretary of State. And that's because of those women. So, thank you would be my answer.
Thank you. Secretary Lee?
Yes, and I agree completely. It is the courage and the sacrifices of those fearless women that gave women today and our daughters the opportunities that we have. And, to think that without their commitment and their tenacity and their courage, the three of us would not be able to vote today, let alone serve as our state's chief elections officials. So the doors that have been opened and the opportunities that have been created by those leaders who came before us are just remarkable. And, you know, I believe that we honor their legacy by today being civically engaged and encouraging other women in our communities to do the same.
Thank you. Well, all three of you are leaders standing on the shoulders of those suffragists who made it happen. I'm delighted to spend this time with you this afternoon and help us get the word out, the accurate word out about what's happening with you, and help guide us through this election. You're really the election heroes, and I know you've got huge teams that you'll be working with across your states. And that means a lot. That's what our democracy is all about. You all are obviously all members of the National Association of Secretaries of State, where we are proud partners of them. They've been involved with the Rightfully Hers initiative at the National Archives over, well, probably for 2 years plus now. And they've been terrific partners. So thank you for being wonderful representatives of NAS and for taking your time today. I know you are very busy. We look forward to watching all of your good work as the next, how many days left till the election? I'm sure you have it memorized. It's coming up soon. So with that, I want to thank you and thank NAS again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I have a few closing comments and announcements for our viewers. We want to say a special thanks to our donors and members who are with us today. You too can be a part of our cool group of members, history buffs, genealogy enthusiasts, researchers. Join today at archivesfoundation.org. We also invite you to go to, if you're a fan of history-related merchandise, especially women's history-related merchandise, you can buy gifts for yourself or for your friends and family at our nationalarchivestore.org. And through the end of the month, we have a 30 to 50% off sale. So I hope that you might explore that. And this wraps up our 19th Amendment programming for the week. I'm sure we'll have more programming about the 19th Amendment this fall. 19th Amendment is absolutely evergreen at the National Archives. And we want to thank, of course, all of our sponsors you see on the screen there who've made the Rightfully Hers initiative possible. Without them, really, we couldn't do what we're doing, especially as we've moved digitally here over the last couple of months. This is not the end of our programming. I want you to know that we'll have programming coming up in September. We will continue our Presidential Library series, and we have a few other surprises for you. So I encourage you to watch our schedule. Be sure to follow us on social media, check out our website. Things are always being added, and the National Archives will also have some exciting program coming up in September as well. So I would just say, if you take anything away from this week's programming by the National Archives and the Foundation, I hope you'll exercise your right and responsibility to vote. September 22nd is National Voter Registration Day. And as we hear all the deadlines from varying state to state, you need to know to get your information in, to get your vote in, to get your ballot in. So make sure you're in the know. And those dates obviously can be found at the hashtag we mentioned, Trusted Sources 2020. Trusted Info 2020. As history shows us, having your vote counted and your voice heard is the greatest way to influence democracy. We look forward to seeing you on social media. We hope you tune in for our next program. And on behalf of the National Archives Foundation, thank you for joining us today.